So I wanted to try to do the putting clinic that I wish that I would have had when I was starting out. Just to kind of talk about what it is that we're doing when we're putting. There's a better understanding of physics now, and there's one thing that all great putters do, PGA Tour guys, they all have one thing in common. There's a million different ways to set up, but the one thing they all have in common is they get the ball rolling as quickly as possible. Most people bounce the ball. So the advantage of rolling the ball as quickly as possible is it's much more predictable for both your line and your speed. So if your ball, it's kind of like interference. It's like if you've got an interference pattern, if this thing's bouncing down the fairway, it's not going to be very predictable. But if it's tightly gripping the ground, we're going to be able to judge our distance a lot better, and it's going to roll theoretically more straight. It's going to hit less, infringements or whatever impediments that are going to be sending it offline if it's bouncing. So if we know that, our goal in putting is to create a predictable roll, then we can kind of turn our clinic into we're engineers now. So how do we create a machine or a robot that will roll the ball as predictably as possible? And the first thing to understand with this robot is the idea of the grandfather clock pendulum, and they figured out that you want to have a positive angle of attack or angle of ascent. So what that means is you're basically hitting up on the ball slightly. So they want that to be around 3 or 4 degrees. That gets the ball up onto the ground, or up onto the grass. There's an idea that it's kind of a 2D thing, putting, but that initial lift is actually necessary to get the ball up onto the grass so it can start rolling. So we want to position this robot. Imagine the robot is built, looks just like a human. So the middle point of the robot would be the sternum. So if that's the middle point, that's where the club is going to be at its lowest in theory. So if we want to hit just barely up on it, it would make sense that we would play the ball position off of our left eye, just barely ahead of our sternum. That will help us bottom out just before the ball and the grandfather clock pendulum is starting to come on the upswing. Okay, so they say that's about 4 degrees, but relative to that, you want less loft. So you want to be hitting up on the ball with effectively negative loft. So if we're hitting up on it 4, just based on the angle of the upswing, you want to have 2 degrees of loft. So that's where most people get screwed, is because they got too much loft. So you can mitigate loft with a little bit of forward press. That effectively changes the dynamic loft. Or you can go and get fit for a putter that fits your particular setup ideally. If you want to go through and get a perfect setup, the best person in town to see is Blair Phillip at Breakthrough Golf Technology. He's like a putting guru. So until that day, you can play around with your forward press to set yourself up to have a positive angle of attack with a relatively negative loft. You're not going to hit down on the ball, you're going to lift it up, but relative to that upswing, the loft is pointing it down a little bit. So that's the first principle that we need to figure out. So we're going to position this robot so that it's attacking the ball. And then you want to start thinking about, if we were going to build a very predictable robot, would you want this thing to have twisty levers and stuff, or would it be better to just have it almost on a track? Ideally, spoiler alert, ideally you're not rigid, but you want to eliminate as many variables as you can. So that brings in the 19 Crimes training aids here, and I'll let y'all kind of get used to these. Basically what it does for me is I feel like I got kind of like prayer hands, and the palms stay facing each other. The duct tape on this one is proprietary and it's coming off a little bit, but you get the idea. So if you find yourself being a very wristy putter, this is kind of just like a good thing to check in with, and You're welcome. Just to feel what it's like to.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So you see, can you even just keep it a little bit more? Imagine you got like a home plate,
Right.
like a baseball home plate in your arms, and you maintain that. And it might feel kind of awkward, but if you're really struggling with putting, maybe let's try to simplify it as much as possible. Let's eliminate a variable if we don't need to. So that might be a cool little theory thing for us to consider. If we don't want this robot to be twisting and turning its swinging arm, maybe we can figure out a way to position the ball properly and to make it as consistent of a rock as possible. Okay, and then the other thing that PGA Tour players all have in common is they hit the putt very solidly. So a way that you can check the centeredness of your contact is just to get some foot powder spray and spray it on your club face, and it won't do any harm to anything. So if you come in and you're hitting, you can just check and see where you're at on that day, and just make sure you're contacting somewhere in the center of the putter. Believe it or not, if you hit it out on the toe or on the heel, it has a pretty darn huge effect on the start line, especially on short putts. If you've got a 3-footer and you're a little shaky, sometimes a good drill is just to imagine this is a hammer, and then on the back of the golf ball, in the very center of the golf ball, there's just a little tiny nail. You're trying to put the middle of the hammer on the middle of the nail. It's just kind of a nice little mental trick to think about centeredness of contact. So we want our robot to hit right on the center of that golf ball. We want it to be positioned so that it's hitting up slightly on the ball with negative loft. And then we got to get this thing honed in. We got to bring this machine out here and start teaching it to aim. So a great way to move my camera a little bit. A great way to work on your aim is to know where straight is. So Seymour Putters has this cool gizmo. You can do it with the chalk line, you can do it with many different ways, but basically we know where straight is now. And like Curtis was talking about, you know, sometimes where you're aiming in actuality is much different from where you think you're aiming. So if you set it flush with this and you see your line going through the string, all of a sudden you know where straight is. And it could be just enough to get rid of a bad habit if you aim way right and push it, or aim way left. And you got to make all sorts of unnecessary manipulations. In a perfect world, this robot would be aimed right on target.
To me, you're too far.
Set it up completely flush with it.
It's right up on there.
Yeah, get it right up on there.
Like, yeah,
So does that feel like? Further left than you would usually aim, trying to aim right at it, or further right?
It was about where I think I would.
Okay, well you might not have aiming issues.
Down, you're like,
Oh, am I sticking it out there?
yeah.
Well, yeah, because
Well, it looks like
I
from
feel
the
like
back
I'm
here.
always like, instead of having it out there,
You either need to have
I
that
like
reed
get up
bent
high.
or something, but you're like,
Yeah, bring it in. Yeah, it does seem like a lot of lean in.
yeah, this is how you're looking like,
Yeah,
instead of having it down here.
Yep. Now that's a good example. That's a good little aside. We'll set this like this. So another thing that a lot of putters have in common is that angle that you're demonstrating. This shaft, Curtis, come look at this.
Is there a requirement for a certain amount of angle? Because
You can't
have it perpendicular.
You can't have a perfectly perpendicular lie angle.
Okay. What's the maximum upright that you can have?
I think you got to have a 10-degree gap.
10
I
degree.
believe.
Okay.
Don't quote me on that.
This
I know it
seems
can't be perfectly straight, but Bryson DeChambeau is kind of like hacking around that. He's setting his body up in such a way he's trying to mimic a perfect 90-degree angle.
Pendulum.
But with the exception of Mickelson, and I'm sure there's many more, Mickelson kind of sets up like this, where there's this sort of compound angle going on. But one of the things, if I was going to build a robot to roll the ball as consistently as possible, you kind of want a straight line through this arm down through the shaft. And sorry, it's Alex, right? Like Alex was telling you, he said, can you kind of like set up this way where I'm standing right now so the camera can see?
Yeah.
So set up like where you feel like the hands are really low, like this way.
Oh, low like
Like
that.
that
okay.
way.
Like over exaggerated low.
Yeah, but you kind of want to just imagine that this shaft is running through your forearm.
Oh, okay.
And that you've got that home plate in your arms, so you can just rock the home plate.
Maybe a little bit better for you.
Big.
This one.
Curtis, let me see your setup on a normal one.
Yeah,
Do you
this
consider
one's
yourself a pretty good putter?
Pretty sharp angle.
Now I
right?
do.
Mhm.
Okay, now that
We
we
ought to
got
be able
your
to tell if we
aim
put them
dialed
both
in, confidence
flat. Like
is a
this is
part of
flat
it.
and that's flat.
Yeah, that's
that
good.
much
As long
difference,
as
but
your
it-
angle
Plus the grip though.
is somewhere through your forearm,
Yeah, mine
that's
is
great.
lean back
It just
a little
gets
more.
unnecessarily complicated
Not as much as I would
if
have
we're
thought.
introducing strange angles. They're either too high or too low.
Yeah, I have always lifted up on it or something, or released my arms up. And I think I do that. I
drag
think I
your
stand
toes
over
up.
it and I drop my
Straight
arms
down.
and I try to keep the face flat, even if I have to hunch over it to get this pendulum. And that's not good, right?
Yeah, you don't want
Curving-
you want to
curving like
set
this.
up comfortably and then let your implement, serve you. You're not trying to contort yourself to make the implement work. So once we got our aim figured out, then we can start to try out some different drills. This is a good handy one to work on your aim and your stroke. If you're able to successfully roll it down the length of a yardstick without it, I'll do a bad one first. It's going to fall off the edges. If you deliver a center strike like we're talking about hammering that nail, you should be able to roll it down the length of the yardstick without it falling off. That left a little bit early, so I know my face was a little bit closed.
Need a wider
So-
yardstick.
Yeah, that would make
Or a deeper
I got
groove.
one.
Or a
Yeah,
deeper
I'll
groove.
But when you're on a conference call in the office, there's no better way to
Yeah.
hone that baby in for your trip
Oh,
to
yeah.
La
Oh,
República
yeah, try that,
Dominicana.
Alec.
Next.
And just some stuff around the house that can get you dialed in. And then all of a sudden you hit 100 of these, and then those little 3-footers don't look so scary. There you go.
Perfect.
Got a good putter.
Beginner lock there.
I think use this hole. That way I can tell.
Do this again, and I'll be like, oh my God, look at you.
Bingo.
Wow.
All those years of high school golf didn't go to waste on me. Most of it was learned after high school. Oop, that one.
So if you want to try that one out,
I need to go like that. Oh, that was way off. Wow. Yeah, I need a larger yardstick.
excellent.
There it is.
What can you describe what it kind of encourages you to do?
It really makes me
Helps your
focus
aim.
on the
Your aim
how
too.
smooth and straight back and forth.
Okay.
'Cause I
That
never,
and going with
you
the
never actually have that line to look at.
Better.
further down there.
Yeah. Okay, I'll
Okay.
practice that.
So this one is a little bit more lenient.
Kind of like your iron shots. I mean, if you aim with your
That's what I do right across there.
You were able to do this one pretty successfully. This one's a little bit more lenient. Curtis, can you show us how it's done over here? This is a local company. 5 dudes.
I pick a spot and put at it.
And this stick is pointed straight at the
That
hole.
stick is more or less straight at the hole. We've got a little ball mark so we mark our spot. And as we're stepping in on this ball, ideally the middle of the golf ball is, the orange line is running right through the equator of the golf ball, and then you can match up your club line to that line as well. So you just get a good feeling of square setup. And then we've got a gate there at the end, so it's just another version of the ruler. Excellent.
It's like croquet.
It is a little baby croquet set.
Starting with it on the dot there, or
Just inside the dot, so that when you're looking, over here.
on this.
So when you're looking down on that bad boy,
oh, it's centered.
the
I
orange
see.
should be cutting through the equator of the golf
I
ball.
gotcha. Okay, that's.
So you know that you're perfectly set up. And then this introduces the next concept of eye line.